So, as we all know, the talks are about happiness in daily living. And happiness in the context of these talks means unbroken peace of mind. And unbroken peace of mind is there when suffering doesn't arise. And suffering is not pain in the moment. It is an uncomfortableness with oneself, an uncomfortableness with the other, an uncomfortableness with life. Ultimately, all of those are an uncomfortableness with oneself. And that uncomfortableness with oneself exists horizontally in time. And what that means is that a lot of the time that we're uncomfortable, it isn't because of the circumstance that we're in, but because of something that has happened or something that might happen. And the uncomfortableness is stretching itself throughout the present moment. And when we look at it, that uncomfortableness that might have been going for 10 minutes or 3 hours or 2 days is about the past or the future. And so it's very important for us to start to observe and recognize the uncomfortableness and the narrative of the uncomfortableness in order for us to realize, this is suffering. This is what is interfering with my peace of mind. It's not really much good having the concepts if we then don't see the concepts or see what the concepts are pointing at for ourselves in daily living. So expectation, for example, is one of the forms of suffering, and it is our idea of what we need, how we need things to turn out in the future in order for everything to be okay, in order for us to be complete. And so if you find yourself having debates or conversations in your head with someone who you have a disagreement with, or running over scenarios about a meeting, let's say, that's coming up with someone, and if you know what the topic's about, and you know that you'll have some sort of disagreement or see things from slightly different perspectives, and you're always trying to come up with what you're going to say to win the situation, to try and convey your point of view to the other so that the other does what you would like them to do. So, for example, it might be a client who has queried, I don't know, the charges that they're paying, for example. And you might be there thinking about the meeting that's coming up and justifying the charges in your head and all of this. And so there's a difference if it's just the working mind saying, okay, these are the points and this is what I'm going to deliver. That's one thing. But what could happen is that you're going over and over and over these things, making the client wrong, going over why they don't understand why these charges are there and how much time it takes for something and how much it costs to run the business, etc., etc. And at some point, we might realize that we're just trying to, we have an imagination and an expectation of what we want to happen. And we're spending all of this time thinking about it and debating with the person in our head. And this can So maybe the example of a meeting with a client who's querying the charges is not the best example, because it implies that there is going to be a one-off meeting and you have to have your argument ready, or your explanation ready. But there are other situations with friends or work colleagues where you're always in disagreement. And so you might be, let's say, just walking and thinking about them, and then this debate comes up in your head, where you are actually having a conversation with them in your head, and you're trying to win. And so that is a form of this noise in our head. And it's there as part of our sense of self that wants to feel inflated. And it's imagining a circumstance, and it has an expectation of what will make everything okay. You could be thinking about some investment that you've made, and how in the future, when things work out a certain way, this is what you're going to do, and it's going to be fantastic. And if this is what you're thinking about all of the time, or a lot of the time, hopefully attention can land on this and see that we're trying to win, or we're trying to imagine another circumstance in life. And it can seem justifiable, it can seem like it has a purpose. And if we can see that it is a form of suffering, when it's happening, we might just say, stop. And if the stopping happens, if we stop debating in our head and trying to win, and imagining how life is going to be when things maybe in the future turn out a certain way, we just stop. What you'll experience is the ending of that noise, that mental noise, and you'll feel the relief and the presence. And so in this case, I'm not talking about guilt or blame, which are heavier feelings of suffering, and they're clearly uncomfortable, because there is a blaming and a regretting in the past. And what I'm talking about here is a narrative about the future, and often it seems like it's an imagination of a better future, or an imagination of getting what we want. And so it can seem like it's worthwhile. And so that type of thinking gets to go on longer than other thinking that is seen to be problematic because of its content. And it's only when this thinking starts getting cut off that we feel that too is definitely a form of suffering. And it's only if it's become very clear that really what we're looking for is more and more presence, more and more connectedness to that part of ourself that doesn't need things to turn out a certain way in order for it to feel good now. That part of ourself that is covered up by that thinking. So our priority needs to be that. And if it's that, once we see these ongoing conversations in our head as a disturbance of that, that's when we have reason to cut them short. And in the same way, if you're thinking about someone you've just seen on social media and a post that they had written, and maybe they had a different view to you, or they said something that you know, created a reaction, and then you find yourself making them wrong or trying to justify your position. And this can go on for a long period of time if we realize, oh, that's more of this thinking that doesn't need to be there. And maybe there's a stopping that can happen. It's like, oh, I don't need to keep investing in that. In a way, there also needs to be some rationale. It's like, let me just leave everyone with their own opinion. It's okay that someone has a different opinion. My involvement in it is a judgment, in a sense, a judgment of their view, wanting their view to change, wanting to be right or to win, feeling superior and making them inferior, which is once again a form of judgment. And so, in particular, this is talking about the extension of our thinking in time. And what's most important is to look at the thinking when you're on your own, the thinking in between events. The actual reaction in a moment often doesn't fit into the category of suffering. It fits more into the category of the circumstantial response, which you could say is a biological reaction. And so even anger arising, for example, is part of the circumstance, and the suffering is afterwards when we're feeling guilty about it, or going over why we got angry, blaming the other person for making us angry, wishing that we hadn't got angry. And all that happens after the anger. And it can happen and carry on for the whole day. So if we see that that's the blame, that's the guilt, that's the mental noise of suffering, that's the psychological me that is holding on to what happened as if it is my doing, and holding on to the pain and wanting that pain to not have been there, the pain of getting angry, for example, or the pain of getting angry and then having the other not like us, or get angry back, or be sad. And so holding on to that, meaning being attached to the fact that there was pain in the moment, and then feeling guilty about it, or trying to explain it, rationalize it. So all that thinking, it can keep going on for hours about something that happened. That's the suffering. The actual interaction with the person, that takes, goes on for a minute or two, usually. It's short. So the events that we think about make up a tiny, really, when you look at it, a really small portion of the 24 hours of a day. And the suffering fills in all of the gaps. So the doer, or the me, or the psychological identity, those are all different names for the same phenomenon, and that is the identity, which is a psychological identity. It doesn't really exist except as an idea or a belief of who we are. That is the identity that at the root of the narrative, I hate you because you hurt me. In the narrative, there is the me, I. So I per se is not the problem. So if I say I went to the shops, that's not the psychological me. We can still have use of the personal pronoun I and you. So the issue isn't seeing myself as an I and seeing you as a you. It's the psychological identity is the I that sees oneself as the doer and then blames oneself, sees the other as the doer and then blames them, and feels anxiety and feels expectation. And so the psychological me exists in the narrative of guilt and blame and pride and worry and expectation. So the psychological me, the psychological identity, is the narrative. And if we look at the root of the narrative, we can say that's the root of the psychological me. And so the root of the narrative is the belief, the attitude of personal doership and attachment to outcome. And when that seed is in place, that seed is in place when we see ourselves, when we know ourselves, when we see life as this, this playground, this environment, with a whole lot of independent humans that are all in control of what they're doing. That's how we see it. We believe that we're in control of what happens and that the other is in control of what happens. And if life hasn't reconditioned us, so life put all of that in place, and so generally speaking, we see this three-dimensional world and time that flows horizontally, and the three-dimensional world of and time that we find ourselves in is populated by all of these people. And the way we interpret how everything happens is by the person who is a separate, independent, autonomous being, choosing and doing whatever they are, doing what they are in control of. And so that's the way we see life. And so that means the belief of personal doership and the belief that my happiness is to be found in the future and outcomes. That's the root of the psychological me. And then the psychological me comes into existence whenever circumstance triggers a narrative that says, I'm not good enough, you're not good enough, life should be different, why is this happening? That narrative has in it the psychological me. If someone says, what did you do yesterday? And you say, oh, I went to the shops and I spent the afternoon in the garden. That's not the psychological me. Now, we might think that, the psychological me is if there is the sense and the belief that there is an I, that there is a person. And I say, no, that's not the psychological me. That's not what dissolves. What dissolves is the idea that there is a person separate and independent from life, meaning autonomous and disconnected and uninfluenced by life. Whereas in fact, the person has always been heavily influenced, completely influenced by the environment it's grown up in, and by the genetic blueprint that was put in place at conception. And so the environment and the blueprint are two factors that we've had no control over, and they are the only two factors that shape the human being on a biological and psychological level. And why I say they're the only two factors is because the genetic blueprint grows into the whole of the physical entity, and the condition that hardware receives is ongoing moment after moment after moment. And there's nothing else that has contributed to the human being being this way except for those two factors, the genetics, which are very complex, but they are expressing in this moment as the physical body, including the brain, and the totality of momentary input over the course of the life has contributed to what exists right now. So it's genes and up-to-date conditioning. And so if that's understood, we'll see that we can't think anything or say anything or feel anything or do anything unless that is a result of who we are, which is a result of these factors that we're not in control of, and they're factors that we can call life. So we are an extrusion of life, not separate from life, always connected to life. If we were separate from life, we wouldn't be impacted by anything. We wouldn't hear what the other person says. We wouldn't have emotions because of what's happening in the environment. The sun wouldn't tan us. We wouldn't feel hot or cold in the environment we're in because we would be separate. And what happens is we take our cue from the senses, and the senses create a sense of separation because of how the objects are sensed. So the sense of sight creates boundaries, or the object itself seems to have a boundary. And so our sight tends to separate the environment into many, many separate objects, coupled by the fact that our intellect and language has names and labels for each object. And so when we look at the environment, we see a collection of objects. So sight has a way of quasi-separating sight and language. And sounds are attributed and seem to come from specific objects. And one sound is different from the other sound as it's perceived, or at least it's perceived in a way that different sounds can be distinguished from each other. And so, once again, many sounds are heard as a collection of sounds. The car, the dog barking, someone talking, the doorbell ringing, the phone beeping. And the way that our brain processes all these sounds is it knows each of them as separate and independent sounds. So once again, there is a separation that is created, but the separation is not an actual separation. It's the way that the perception perceives life. And the same goes for our own bodies. We see our own body separate from other objects. We feel, there's the sense of touch that delineates our body from the other objects. So in perception, there is separation. And that separation isn't ultimately the problem. That doesn't have to stop. But it's interesting to see how, because that is there, it can create a deeper, or it can obscure an appreciation of a non-separation on the senses. So for us to go beyond the separation of the senses, we need to think about how the senses tend to create the impression of separation. Or not necessarily just an impression, it creates a separation on a certain level, and that separation on that level of perception is not really a problem. It's not ultimately a problem. But if it prevents us from seeing the deeper connectedness, then it becomes, well, that not seeing the deeper connectedness is the problem. And so seeing that we are affected by everything that happens in the environment, that we are conditioned by things that happen in the environment, might get us to appreciate that we are not ever separate from the wind, from the sun, from the voices of the other, from the actions of the other. As soon as they are perceived, we are one with them. As soon as they are heard, we are one with them. As soon as they are processed by our system, we are one with them. So we really are like fish in the water. The fish in the water are not separate from each other. So this is why sometimes I encourage the exploration of the present moment and suggest that dropping into the heart, allowing the center of consciousness to just drop as if it's being dragged down by gravity from the head, which is where we tend to be thinking about all sorts of things. That once again creates a separation from the present moment. Intellectually, there's a quasi separation because we're thinking about something else. And so if we can drop into the heart and open the gaze so that the gaze allows the whole environment to fit into our field of vision. And you can do the same with your field, the field of awareness, the auditory field. Allow it to, in a way, open up so that all of the sounds are heard as a symphony within the auditory field. And then maybe blend or allow a blending of the visual and the auditory and any other senses, the thoughts, the emotions, and see this moment as a tapestry, a three-dimensional tapestry, multi-sensory experience. And from this perspective, maybe all of the objects start to be seen as really one big object of experience. And the body is an object, just like the table, the chair, just like the other person, an object of sight within the broader field of vision. And you can drop the idea that it is the eyes that are seeing, drop the idea that it is the ears that are hearing, and maybe realize that that which is alive, that which is aware, that which exists, is the background of everything that's happening. That the body too is seen as an object not by the eyes necessarily. We can allow that concept to dissolve while in that exploration of the present moment. And this can start to demonstrate the non-separateness. We can see the non-separateness on an experiential level. The senses can be perceived from a different perspective, where instead of seeing lots of different objects, a collection of separate objects, we can see everything arising as a singular arising within the field of awareness. And the purpose of this is not solely to see the oneness of life, the non-separation of life. But more importantly is if we're present with what is, without an intention to change it, just being formless awareness prior to the body or beyond the body, recognizing that awareness is aware of everything, then of significance is the fact that there's really nowhere to go. The show is right here. And the thinking can slow down. And it may seem irrelevant to think about what happened yesterday or what might happen tomorrow. So abide in I am, or abide in the self, is not saying that there is the self and there is you that abides in the self, but rather it's pointing to the fact that there is on the outer level the thinking mind that sees I as the one that needs to get somewhere and does something and finds issue with all these different things that are happening in life, feeling like we have to, blame the other and hate the other and get revenge, or at least have the other apologize, or whatever the situation is stirring up in us. That's on the outer level, let's say, like on the surface of the lake. There is that part of ourself, and that is, let's say, if it is guilt and blame, that's the psychological me, and it's all this thought, and the psychological me is found in the narrative itself. And the self with a capital S is the depth of who we are. And so it's not about me abiding in some separate self, but rather more about the psychological me quietening down and rolling back into the depth of who we are, which we can call the self. And so as we rest there more and more frequently, we might find that there's less and less to think about there. That the stories, the situations that need to be dealt with so urgently when we're grounded in the psychological me, tend to become much less relevant. So this dropping back into a place of silence and stillness, where there is simply witnessing, not by a witnesser, but rather the formless witnessing of what we are prior to identifying with the body. So that falling back is sometimes accompanied by a cutting off of thinking. And the cutting off really is where there is a recognition that blame has been going on for the last 3 hours, and something just says stop. And in that moment, the story is suspended. It's like, oh, actually, that's not really important. And we get to say that and drop out of it once we have found that there is this more precious place that we can spend more time in. And we get to spend more time there when we spend less time thinking about hating the other and seeing the other as a competitor and a rival and an enemy, where we feel suspicious of the other. And seeing life as destiny, understanding that life is unfolding moment after moment, we can call that destiny unfolding exactly as it's destined to unfold, and that you and the other are always functioning according to one's destiny. And so whatever has happened was part of your destiny and part of the other's destiny. So with this understanding, if that starts to kick in, then the stopping of the narrative becomes easier too, because the narrative is never seeing that as destiny. It's seeing it as what shouldn't have happened and comparing it to what we believe should have happened. So a cutting off of the thinking mind, because it's seen to be the uncomfortableness, it's seen to be a neglecting of seeing life as destiny unfolding. And hopefully a remembering that while we're in suffering, it's uncomfortableness and we're not grounded in self. So remember, all of the concepts are there only insofar as they can help us identify suffering, remind us that suffering is not an optimal functioning. And if the teaching, which is really life, sinks in a certain way, then a dropping out of that suffering may happen. It's not something that you or I as doers do. In fact, what hopefully we see is that there is no doer, there is just a conditioned instrument that has been conditioned by life to see itself as separate and be attached to outcomes and blame the other and blame itself. And now there may be the appreciation that life is delivering new conditioning, the biological instrument is changing, and the suffering is being cut off, and we're dropping into a space of quietude. So the concepts are really there to inspire a movement towards the absence of suffering.